Hare Krishna. So, what happens if you fail? That may be a question that people have in spiritual life. And it's not as if the process of spiritual life is immediately and clearly successful for everyone. There is a chance that we start and we have a setback, maybe even a long setback. We're going to talk about a story today of one such setback that's from the 6th Canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, and it's the story of Ajamila. Ajamila was a pious Brahmana, and what I want everyone just to recognize here is that this particular section of time, which happens every Thursday from 7 to about 8:30, is either filled with our stories from the Vedas slot or with the What's Up With That slot, where we talk about the paranormal. So with the stories of the Vedas, we're discussing actual stories from particularly Srimad Bhagavatam, because there's many stories there. And from the What's Up With That side, we're talking about various aspects of the paranormal and how that folds back into the Vedic understanding. And we can see that there is a large body of knowledge, the Vedas, which help us to understand many of the things that seem very peculiar in the world around us. And some people have had direct experience with these things. Others may find them difficult to believe, but at any rate, that's what the What's Up With That series is about. By the way, next week we'll be finishing with part 2 of Ajamila. We're only going to do part 1, which is the story of his life. In part 2 of Ajamila, we're going to discuss the philosophical implications of an argument that happened after the confrontation with the Yamaduttas and the Vishnuduttas. So I'm going to start here with an overview of today's session, Ajamila being delivered. So we're going to talk about Ajamila being the son of a Brahmana, and he's on the path. Then we're going to talk about him seeing a low-class couple enjoying. Finally, Ajamila marries the prostitute he sees enjoying, begins a life of crime. And later on, he has many sons. The 10th one of them is named Narayana. He names him Narayana, which is actually a name of God. And then finally, Ajamila, in his old age, is dying. And as he's dying, he's calling out to his son. And appearing to claim him are the Yamaduttas, who are the messengers, who claim those who have led a very dissolute and unspiritual life, those who are very sinful. So those are the Yamaduttas. But they are thwarted by the Vishnuduttas, who stop them from being able to lay hands on Ajamila. And then, of course, we're going to talk a little bit about sin, the karmic cycle, and a little bit about Vishnuduttas and the Yamaduttas as well, how these two groups, what they actually are, how they work in our overall Vedic picture of the entire universe. All right. So the story is not a very elaborate or difficult one. Ajamila starts out as a young boy, maybe more like an adolescent boy. and he is carrying out the orders of his father, and he's coming from a good family, a Brahmana family, so from an early age they start him on the process of learning the Vedas, of following various prescriptions for purification and performing various yajnas. So he's doing this, and he was coming from the area the Bhagavatam tells us of Kanyakubja, which is the modern-day Kannauj in India. And this story has a preface. It begins here as far as Ajamila is concerned, but it actually philosophically begins a few verses before, because what we have is a question by Maharaj Pariksit to Sukadeva Goswami. So Sukadeva Goswami is actually the one who is explaining spiritual life to Maharaj Pariksit. That's a story in itself, which we haven't told, but we're just going to give you a brief overview of that part. That Maharaj Pariksit was cursed that he would die in 7 days. He was a great king, so he decided to fast by the banks of the Ganges and try to make an understanding of what life was all about before his brief life was about to be over in 7 days. During that time, many sages were there, and he asked them various questions, but they seemed to give different answers. So finally, Sukadeva Goswami was elected from among the whole group to represent the entire thing and give the highest, most conclusion, which he did. And so as they're conversing for those days, one of the questions that came up that Pariksit asked Sukadeva Goswami, who was in the seat explaining to him, Pariksit asks Sukadeva Goswami, "My dear Sukadeva, you have just told me about hell," which is, of course, one of those places which everybody has heard about at one point or another, where people are tormented for their ill behavior during their lifetime. Of course, in the Vedas, hell is not permanent. Hell is a transitional phase which people undergo to purify them of all the problems and pain that they've caused to others. So this is one thing that's described. This is the 6th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, as you'll see there, 6:1-10. But before that, in the 5th canto, hell is vividly described, and there's some 27, 28 varieties of different places in hell where you can be nicely tortured in a subtle body so you don't actually die. And this is now the question that Pariksit is asked, well, how do we make sure that we don't wind up there? So Sukadeva Goswami replies in a very interesting way. He says, well, one has to perform prayaschitta, or atonement, because if one does not perform atonement for one's sinful acts, then one will certainly be required to atone for them in hell. Now, what happens actually is that this is not the real answer. And Sukadeva Goswami is testing Maharaj Pariksit to see if he'll accept this answer, because this is a common answer, and this is the way most people think, that if one performs some sinful act, then they have to atone for it. If they perform a very grievous act, they have to perform a difficult atonement. If they perform a less onerous act, then they don't have to perform such a difficult purifying activity to offset it. So this is not the answer, and Pariksit does not accept this answer. He says, my dear Sukadeva Goswami, but we see that sometimes one who is very alert so as not to commit sinful acts is victimized by sinful life again. Therefore, I consider this process of repeated sinning and atoning to be useless. It is like the bathing of an elephant. For an elephant cleanses itself by taking a full bath, but then throws dust over its head and body as soon as it returns to land. So this is the elephant bath analogy. Kvachin nirvatate bunrat kvachit charati tapuna prayas chittam ato par tam manye kunjara sauchavat. So prayas chittam there, that word, relates to the idea of atonement. And in India, especially those who follow the Vedic path in some way or another, generally there are quite well spelled out prescriptions for what to do if you commit a particular act. And some of them are pretty intense. It's the kinds of things you have to do to atone for them. However, as practitioners of Bhakti Yoga, we are not interested in this at all. Not because we're not worried about the effects of our sinful life, but this is not the method to go about overcoming that. Because as Sukadeva Goswami has supposed, and now Pariksit is countering it, Pariksit is saying that this is like an elephant. Elephants take a bath in the water, and they clean themselves nicely in water. And the first thing that happens when they come out of the water is they throw dirt on themselves. And what I understand from zoologists is this is kind of the elephant's version of suntan lotion. They seem kind of hard to believe that an animal with such thick skin as an elephant would get sunburn, but evidently they must have some kind of issue with the sun. So the reason they throw dirt on themselves is to kind of protect themselves from the rays of the sun. Any rate, it appears that they're cleansing themselves, but right after they come out of the water, they dirty themselves up again. So you wonder what was the point in the bath at all. And in a similar way, we see that in many religions, in many processes, in many different cultures, this idea of performing some kind of atonement. Maybe in some cultures or some religious traditions, one goes to confession. Some cases, one tries to offer some kind of positive effect for the negative effects they've done. Some cases, one explains their iniquities in front of a whole group of people. So there's a number of different ways this might be handled in different traditions. But what is usually never pointed to is this very phenomenon that we do something wrong, we feel remorse, we want to change, but we wind up doing it again. And then we go through the process of atoning again. And this can be just a pointless cycle. And wisely, we can ask the question, is there a point in this cycle? Will anything actually be achieved by this? And this is one of the main themes of this story of Ajamila, is this idea of sinning and atoning. Here's the elephant taking a bath. At one time, in New Vrindavan in West Virginia, when I was living there, we had an elephant. We got her as a baby elephant, and gradually she grew. And so they actually do this. She would, swim in the Ghat. You would think an animal as huge as an elephant wouldn't be able to swim, but they actually can. Somehow or other, they swim. They don't sink to the bottom like a giant boulder or something like that. And so what happened is one day his father sent Ajamila on an errand. He was supposed to collect some articles for a sacrifice. In India, often people perform fire sacrifices, and generally these are done for various mundane purposes. There's a fire, and a brahmana recites some mantras, and they glorify the Supreme Lord, then some various demigods, and there's some items thrown into the fire. It's done in a very specific way. It's done facing a particular direction, and so on and so forth. And so Ajamila was supposed to collect certain kinds of grasses and sticks and firewood and things like that from the forest. But while he was there, he chanced across a low-class man who was at that point engaged in romantic activities with a prostitute, leading up to actually enjoying in sex life with the prostitute. So this is how the story begins. Kanya kub jade vijakas chid dasi patir ajamila namna ashta sadacharo dasya samsarga dushtita. In the city known as Kanyakuj, there was a Brahmana named Ajamila who married a prostitute maidservant and lost all his rabbinical qualities because of the association of that low-class woman. So we see that the senses are very strong. This is another main theme of the Ajamila story, that we actually sometimes know what is good for us. We actually sometimes are even committed to living a particular way. But we see that sometimes the senses can conspire to overturn our better judgment, overturn our will to follow correct activity, to avoid sinful life. And why does this happen exactly? Well, we're going to talk about that kind of at the end of the presentation. But for now, although he was a Brahmana, he was married, he was a young man, he was just beginning his life, he could not put out of his mind this vision of seeing this man enjoying with the prostitute. He became attracted to the prostitute, and soon he abandoned his Brahminical activities and his Brahminical life, and he went to the prostitute, eventually married her, and gave up his Brahminical wife. And his old parents, who had no ability to fend for themselves, they had to live the last part of their life without a son to help them or finance them or anything. So they were in great distress, and his wife was in great distress. But he didn't care anything about this, because his attachment to this prostitute was so strong, it overcame his better knowledge, his better thinking, and he became the servant of this prostitute. Eventually, to keep his family up, he became a thief or a dacoit by profession. He would rob people, cheat people, he would attack people, and in this way he would plunder their wealth. And by performing these activities, he was able to maintain his own family. So this was the life of Ajamila. He went from being a very nice young man who was on the path of spiritual life to now being kind of a thug, more or less living in the shadows of society and doing horrible things to people. Bandi akshay kai tavaschar yur garhitam vritam ashtita vibrat kutumbam asurchir yayatang ashadehina. This fallen Brahmana Ajamila gave trouble to others by arresting them, cheating them, and gambling or directly plundering them. This was the way he earned his livelihood and maintained his wife and children. And in due course of time, Ajamila had no less than 10 children. So he was doing pretty good, and he was 88 years old at the time. So somehow or another he kept it together, you know. Tasya pravaya shaha putra dasya desham tuyo vamana balo narayano namna pritos cha daito brisham. That old man, Ajamila, had 10 sons, of whom the youngest was a baby named Narayana. Since Narayana was the youngest of all the sons, he was naturally very dear to both his father and mother. So always the younger children, because of their broken words, their inability to care for themselves, their investigation of the world around them, their cuteness, and for all sorts of reasons, they are very attracted. The parents are very attracted to them. And this was what was the case with Ajamila. Now, he happened to name his son Narayana, which is actually a name for God. And this is not something peculiar to the Vedas. In most communities of religious people, whether in Europe or practically anywhere, children are named after saints or after manifestations of God or whatever. And this is generally done. In fact, most names trace back directly, most first names trace back directly to some kind of name of the Supreme or some great saint. In this case, Narayan actually means the Supreme Lord. This was not why Ajamil named his son Narayan. It was just a name as far as he was concerned. He was certainly not thinking about Narayan. He was certainly not anymore, as a young man he fell down, and now here it is many, many years later, and he's certainly not lived a life where the Supreme Lord had anything to do with his everyday activities. And of course, this leads to the time that finally Ajamil will come upon death, which will happen to all of us. And so what happens, of course, is as he's very, very old, he is dying in his bed. And when he's dying, because he's lived such a completely unregulated, dissolute life, which caused so much difficulty for many other people, he is being visited now by the Yamaduttas. Hare Krishna. Yeah, right. So he's coming, and the Yamaduttas are coming to take him away. When a person reaches the moment of death, if their life has been very sinful, then what happens to them is that they are arrested by the messengers of hell, the Yamaduttas. These are the original death metal people. They are very fearsome looking. They look terrifying to behold. They have chains and whips, and they are there to terrify and to abuse the person who has themselves abused others now. So, Nishamya Mriyamanasya Mukhato Hari Kirtanam Bhartur Namna Maharaja Parshadha Saha Sapatan. My dear king, the order carriers of Vishnu, the Vishnuduttas, immediately arrived when they heard the holy name of their master from the mouth of the dying Ajamil, who had certainly chanted without offense because he had chanted in complete anxiety. So at the time of death, when a sinful person sees the Yamaduttas, then they actually are terrified at the visage of the Yamaduttas coming towards them. And this was what was happening to Ajamil. He didn't know what to do. And all he could think was to call his son. Of course, his son was unable to help him in any kind of way. That was certainly not going to be anything. But he was just wanting to see his son because of the way that he was thinking at that moment. However, his son happened, by his own hand, to have been named Narayana. So his son was, I don't know whether his son was there or not. We don't even hear whether he saw his son before he left. And what took place was that as the Yamaduttas came to claim Ajamil, they were stopped by another group of people who are shown here with 4 arms and bluish in complexion. And they forbade the Yamaduttas from claiming Ajamil. And they were disturbed by this, because this had never happened before. When they are sent out to reclaim someone who is very sinful, they're used to getting their man, and they come back, and then they engage that person in dragging them to where they'll be judged by Yamaraj. And then after being judged by Yamaraj, they may again take that person to hell for various tortures, because that's the nature of their duty. So Ajamil had unintentionally called a name of God at the time of his departure. And as a result, the Vishnuduttas interceded, and they stopped the Yamaduttas from being able to claim Ajamil. Ajamil witnessed this happen, And he was terrified, but now he felt that something had saved him. He wanted to call out to the Vishnuduttas, but as they saw that he was trying to form words, they themselves disappeared. And so the Yamaduttas are gone and the Vishnuduttas are gone. It's just Ajamila in his bed. He did not die at that point. He had a close-on experience with death, but he did not actually pass at that moment. Instead, he has a change of heart, and he begins to realize his whole life is a waste. He begins to think, why have I lived this way? What is these Yamaduttas certainly had the right to take me to hell, but for some reason they were stopped. And now I must make restitution of my life. So he gave up his family and he went to the forest and he began to cultivate spiritual life in a very, very focused manner. He began to meditate. He began to try to read the scriptures, to understand his position. And of course, eventually, what happens is he does leave his body, but in this case, the Yamaduttas are not part of the scenario. Next time, the messengers of the order carriers of Vishnu, the Vishnuduttas, they come and they claim him in a flower airplane to take him back to the spiritual world. So here we have a story about someone who started out life on the right foot, who genuinely was trying to practice spiritual life, but was overwhelmed by their own senses and made a deep mistake. And that mistake became a whole lifestyle that lasted for the better part of his life, and his life appeared to be quite a long life. But at the last moment, he was saved by having accidentally called out the name of God. And then he got a second chance to look over everything and change the way he lived. So we're going to talk a little bit further about this in next week's episode, part 2. But for now, I want to kind of finish up with two ideas here, the Yamaduttas and the Vishnuduttas. Actually, the Vishnuduttas are above on the opposite side, as the Yamaduttas are above on the opposite side. So the Vishnuduttas are in blue and the Yamaduttas are there in dark brown. So the Yamaduttas are called Duttas, which means servants or messengers of Yama. Yamaraj is the demigod in charge of perdition and judgment of those who are not spiritually inclined at all. And he has the task of deciding what happens to them, what kind of hellish punishments they might get, or maybe they will just be demoted to an animal body or something like that. Or maybe both things will happen. So for Yamaraj, he's like the supreme judge. He judges people at the last stage of their life, and then after judging them, they have to comply with whatever he deems to be their next fate. And of course, this is a process, and even if one goes to hell, one will eventually be released. And in hell, the Yamaduttas are the ones who take charge of various punishments that exist there. The Vishnuduttas, on the other hand, in blue, they're residents of the spiritual world, not the heavenly planets, but the spiritual world. So one thing that's missing in Abrahamic religions and their understanding of the whole cosmos is this distinction between the heavenly planets and the spiritual world proper. The heavenly planets are a place where a person goes to receive the pious results of a pious life. One enjoys there, certainly. And certainly in the heavenly worlds, God is there, but there's a lot of other things there too, all kinds of various enjoyments. But still, even though one can stay there for millions of years in the heavenly worlds, one eventually has to come back here to the earth plane again, because one cannot stay there forever. Beyond the entire material universe, including the hellish planets, including the heavenly planets, including our planet, beyond this is the spiritual world where the Supreme Lord actually resides. And there is the spiritual world itself, where the servants of the Supreme, they have a bodily feature that is very similar to the Supreme. They have 4 arms and they're bluish in complexion, and they serve Vishnu there. And they are the ones who come for those who are very spiritually inclined and who have actually become completely practiced in the idea of serving the Supreme Lord without motivation, without interruption. So these are kind of 2 opposite fates here. So that's the Vishnuduttas and the Yamaduttas. We'll talk more about the Yamaduttas next week because we're going to talk about their conversation or argument with their leader, Yamaraj. Now, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this because this is one of the main themes of this particular section. And this is the cycle of sin and reaction. We can ask, why is it that we may be even committed to spiritual life? We may be committed to living a certain lifestyle pattern. We may seriously want to avoid certain things, but somehow or other, our senses or our desires get the better of us. And this is the basic cycle of sin, and 4 special compartments or aspects of it, which are called Bijam Kutam, Kutastha, or Kutam and Kutastha, Papam and Aparabdha. So we have the sin itself, which is called Papa. We have Aparabdha, which is unmanifested reaction. We have Prarabdha, which is manifested. We have Kutam, or Kutastha, which is sinful disposition. And we have Bijam, sinful desire. And above this we have avidya, or ignorance. So why is it that we find ourselves trapped in this repetitious cycle of sinning and possibly atoning? Some people just sin, they don't bother with the atonement part. So avidya is where it all starts, ignorance. We don't know who we are, or where happiness really is, or what's required of us. We have no understanding of these things. So because we don't, we naturally see the world as a smorgasbord of various kinds of material allurement. And we see that there's nothing more to be done than we figure out which ones of these allurements we like the best. So because we don't know what to do, we try to enjoy whatever's around us. And usually most people grow up as their younger ages with some parental guidance, and they get told what to do, what not to do. Often there's a religious morality somewhere behind the whole thing, where we're explained why we should avoid certain kinds of actions, which may or may not be explained exactly why we should avoid those actions. But at any rate, we are told there are certain things that are off limits. And so because we do not know anything other than enjoying things, we have a sinful disposition, or kutastha, or kutam. Eventually, we come across a situation where a perfect opportunity presents itself for a specific sinful act. We may have heard about the sinful act before. We may have understood that we were supposed to avoid it in one sense or another. But suddenly here it is, a sinful act, and the perfect circumstance to just engage in it without anyone to tell us no. And maybe no one will even know that we've engaged in this sinful act. This is what happened to Ajamila. From a previous life, even probably from his early life, even in this life, he had this desire to enjoy, which he was working at overcoming. But suddenly, here was this opportunity to enjoy with a prostitute. And he had never seriously considered the possibility before, but when it was suddenly presented to him in front of his eyes in such a way, his mind was captured by it. His desire to enjoy was captured by it. And then, as time would go on, he would remove the obstacles to be able to fully engage. So, from a sinful disposition, we get a sinful desire. That sinful desire leads to a sinful action. And generally, the repercussions of sin do not hit us right off the bat. They are delayed. There's a delayed reaction. So this is what's meant by aparabdha. And so this cycle in the middle here between avidya and prarabdha begins to cycle over and over again. One of the particular negative effects of performing a sin is the intense desire to do that sin again. This is not an accident. This is actually the way that the material nature is designed. One of the repercussions of performing an egregious or sinful act is the desire to do it again. This is a natural cycle. We are disposed to do it again. We get the chance to do it again. We do it again. And each time we go around this cycle, we increase our as yet unmanifested reaction, our aprarabdha reaction. We have not been hit by the repercussions of it from the karmic plane yet. We have simply just built up a stockpile, a storehouse of future suffering that we have not yet experienced. And this is obviously an addictive cycle. So when the thing that we have somehow wound up being involved in is deeply sinful, we find ourselves unable to break away from it. And eventually, at some point, this aparabdha goes to prarabdha. It becomes manifest. And then we suffer incredibly. The reason we bring this up is that by chanting the holy name of God, by chanting God's name, and it can be God's name in any tradition, whether it's the Vedic tradition or the Christian tradition or Islamic or whatever it is, by invoking the name of God. We invoke the essence of God. We try to purify ourselves, especially if we're trying to pay attention to invoking the name of God. This name of God is non-different than God himself. And by invoking the name of God, we stop all these manifestations. We cut back on the bijam, sinful desire, the papam, the actions itself. We're not so inclined to them anymore. We are destroying the stockpile of unmanifested reaction that has not yet hit us. And we're diluting down and getting rid of our sinful disposition. So it's getting rid of all four of those things. If a person plants some crop, one, before planting the crop, can go through an incredibly difficult and intricate process of weeding all the weeds out. And one can plant his crop, but the minute that they water the crop, they see that they're planting flowers or their vegetables or whatever they were growing, they come up, but so do the weeds. So if you take a seed and you throw it in ground and that ground is dry and non-conducive to fructification, then that seed will never grow, but it won't die either. It'll simply wait until the opportune moment when water is available, and suddenly it will spring forward. In the same way, with our sinful desires, we may bring them from a past life, and they are like seeds dormant in our heart. And when the right opportunity occurs, suddenly we feel an intense desire to act on them. We are connecting with our sinful desires from the past. But if one takes those desire seeds, those same seeds, and puts them in a frying pan and some oil and cooks them, then we can throw them in the ground. And under no circumstance will that seed ever fructify. in the same way, we say that the process of spiritual life, particularly the chanting of the holy name of God, has this property, that it destroys all these different aspects of it. Therefore, we will not be lost in the cycle of sinning and atoning, sinning and atoning, sinning and atoning. We may still not immediately be relieved from this cycle, but this cycle will, instead of growing deeper and more pernicious, this cycle will eventually evaporate. That is the process of true spiritual life, and the understanding that the best thing we can do is to engage in the chanting of the name of the Supreme Lord, which we do by chanting Hare Krishna. So this brings us to the end. And I just wanted to mention that, again, we're here. If you've seen us on YouTube, we're at Krishna Was Up. That's the YouTube channel, KRISHNA-WAZZUP. That's the name of the channel. And every Thursday, we're here at 26 2nd Avenue, which is in Lower Manhattan at 2nd and East 1st Street. From 7 to about 8:30, we do this session. And after that, then there's some discussion. And next week, we will do part 2, which is the argument between the agents of Yamaraj and Yamaraj. They wonder why they were stopped from picking up their man, Ajamila. Okay, so any questions, comments?
Yes, Maharaj, I have a question. What is a sin? How do I find out what is sinful? Who is defining it?
Right. Yeah, that's a very important question. What is sin, and who says that it's sin? And people get lost in moral relativism. These days especially, moral relativism is quite common an attitude. However, very few people, very few people are true moral relativists when it comes down to it. At some point they draw the line and say, okay, that just won't go. I won't stand for that. No. But in the Vedic literatures, we have various things described as sinful. And one can believe them or not believe them. One can follow or not follow. That's up to the individual, and that's the way the Supreme Lord makes it. That's why we have free will. Particularly in the Vedic literature, there is a idea of 4 basic, most pernicious of sins, and they are illicit sex, gambling, meat eating, and intoxication. These are described in the First Canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. There's a story also with Maharaj Pariksit before he was cursed to die. And in that story we learn that these 4 things are the pillars of dragging someone down into a lower consciousness and into being out of their own control. So again, they are what we call illicit sex, which is what happened to Ajamila. Most people can understand that. Then there's gambling, which is the idea of trying to get something for nothing through some kind of game of chance. Meat eating, which is killing animals just for the sake of one's own taste buds. And intoxication. So these things are quite obvious in our modern society, and they're everywhere. And people may not believe that these things have any effect on their lives, but in time, anyone who's a little thoughtful will begin to see what effect these things have on your life. And so therefore, anyone who's seriously aspiring for spiritual life must work to remove these 4 activities from their everyday life. And it may not be immediately possible to do it, but one has to head in that direction.
You told now that these 4 things are the most sinful activities.
Right.
But I think there are much more sinful activities like killing somebody,
right.
stealing or betraying somebody, lying,
right.
and all the things which harm a living entity,
right,
or which destroys spiritual consciousness.
Right. There are, of course, other things, and these are also described in the Vedas, like murder and theft and taking someone's wife and all these kind of things. These things also have their negative karma. But what we see that, the point that I'm trying to focus on, is there are some very easy to get into difficulties or sinful forms that make it possible to open the door to these more egregious and more drastically. In other words, these are kind of like the trap doors that open the door to the underworld, where even worse things are possible, where people torture other people just because they like it, where people perform sex crimes on other people and all these kind of things. How does one get to that depth? Usually, most people wandering on a certain level of karmic, a certain karmic platform wouldn't stoop to those levels. But through these other trap doors, one gets there over time. We become introduced to darker and darker things through these. So through, for instance, animal slaughter, we come to the point where we hardly make a distinction between slaughtering animals and slaughtering anything else. You know, we may not be ourselves in a slaughterhouse and lifting the blade to kill the animal, but we're buying the animal and then we're eating the animal. So we're participating, and this degrades our sense of compassion. And eventually we make no compassion with anything or anybody. We just feel like whatever we do, it's fine, you know. And similarly, intoxication opens the door to all kinds of things, because when a person is gradually more and more intoxicated, then a person will lose track of who they are, where they are, what they've done, what they haven't done. And often, if certain kinds of intoxication predispose a person to do really vicious things just to be able to get the next chance for their next opportunity for intoxication. Of course, sex life, that's destroyed so many people. It's probably the biggest destroyer. In fact, in the Vedas we understand that out of all the senses, the activity of sex involves all 5 of them, all completely in one activity. And it's the most compelling of all pushings that we ever have. And to overcome it is the most difficult. And that's why in the Vedas there's the institution of marriage, and where we regulate ourselves in some way or another, because uncontrolled sex activity certainly leads to darker and darker things, you know. And so gambling brings us into the association of people who are cheaters by their very character and nature. And so you can see how these 4 things are kind of, as they're said, the trapdoors or the openings to the darker underworld of where people torture each other, where people perform sexual depravity on that causes suffering to others, where people, create wars just for the sake of being able to slaughter a lot of people, and so on and so forth. These kind of mentalities are arrived at through usually not quite so depraved attitudes that bring us there. So that's the way I would respond to your question. There may be other things as well. But, any other questions? Do you have a question? Okay. Okay. So, any rate.
Sorry, man. Where's the temple actually? Do you have nearby?
What's that?
There's a temple close by, right?
Yes, this is 26 2nd Avenue here. But opposite us on the next block over is 25 First Avenue, which is called the Bhakti Center. So you just subtract one number from each one. So 26, you subtract one, makes it 25. So it's 25. And second, you subtract one, that makes it First Avenue. So it's just one block over that way. And that's the Bhakti Center.
Can I just pay my obeisance then?
What's that?
Can I just pay my obeisances then?
Yeah, but can you wait till I turn the cameras off?
Oh,
I will be doing that in just a few minutes. So
it's open,
that way.
right? The temple will be open.
Yeah, I think so. I believe so. All right. So this story is an interesting story from the Vedas. And this series, the idea behind it is that most people have never heard any of these stories unless you were born in India. Even if you were born in India, maybe you haven't heard some of these stories. And through the telling of these stories, we come to understand important themes, important overarching structures in the explanation, the worldview that the Vedas give us, the idea of sin, of repeating of sin, the idea of the holy name, the idea of why it is somebody falls down, the idea of taking sinful tendencies from one life to the next, the idea of being involved more and more intricately in various sinful activities by being involved in lesser sinful activities. So again, next week we're going to do the second part of this Ajamil story. And the week after that, we're going to return to the What's Up With That, where we'll be discussing the paranormal. So thank you all very much for your kind attention, and we'll end here. Hare Krishna.